I was 10 years old when the president said we were the enemy. We lived in Sacramento then. Me, my mother and father, my older sister Emiko, and my little brother Kenji. We were what they called Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. My parents were Issei, born in Hiroshima and Wakayama. They spoke little English, but they never missed a payment on the house, always packed my lunch just right, and flew the American flag every 4th of July. My father ran a small nursery. He had hands stained with soil and pride, and he loved this country, said he could smell opportunity in the earth here. Mama stayed home. She made the best tsukemono in the neighborhood and ironed my school shirts until the creases could cut. Before the war, we were just a family. We went to the Buddhist temple on Sundays, to the movies on Saturdays, double features for a dime, and I played stickball with the boys on the corner. Our dog was named Duke, a mutt with crooked ears. I used to think our lives were pretty much the same as everyone else's. That was before everything changed. December 7th, 1941. I still remember how quiet the house got when the radio man said it. "Japanese planes have attacked Pearl Harbor." My father stood frozen, soap still on his razor. My mother dropped the dish she was drying. My sister turned pale. I didn't understand it at first. Just some faraway island. Then I saw my father sit down and say nothing. That scared me more than the words. The next day at school, kids wouldn't talk to me. Mrs. Clancy, our neighbor, wouldn't look my mother in the eye. Within a week, men with suits came and took away some of the other Issei fathers. Rumors spread that they were spies. My father stopped going out unless he had to. Our flag stayed folded on the shelf. Then came the posters. They were stapled to telephone poles and store windows. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. We were to register, then report to a relocation center. We weren't allowed to bring much, just what we could carry. I asked my father what we did wrong. He didn't answer. On May 27, 1942, we were sent to the Sacramento Assembly Center, a temporary camp on the old fairgrounds. Our stall had walls of plywood and chicken wire. I remember the smell, horses, sweat, dust, and hopelessness. There were no doors, just curtains. Privacy became a memory. My brother cried every night. He was only 6. I tried to be brave for him, but some nights I cried too. I was still a boy. My sister kept a diary. I read a page once. It's like we've all been erased. There was no trial, no hearing, just a quiet vanishing. We left behind our house, our furniture, Duke, everything that made us feel like Americans. They said we were being evacuated for our own protection, but I never saw any white families forced from their homes. Only faces like ours. In late September, they told us we'd be sent to a permanent camp called Tule Lake. I didn't know what Tule Lake was. I imagined something green, with boats and frogs. I was wrong. The train ride there was long, with the windows blacked out. Soldiers with guns stood at each end of the car. One of them looked about Emiko's age. She stared at the floor the whole time. When we arrived, all I could see was dust and fences. Barbed wire curled along the horizon like it was trying to cut the sky. Guard towers loomed, each manned with a soldier and a machine gun. The camp was in the high desert near the Oregon border, blistering hot in the summer, cruel in the winter. Barracks were slapped together with green wood that shrank and cracked with the dry wind. Sand got into everything, our beds, our food, our eyes. You could taste it when you breathed. I looked at my mother that first night. Her hands were red from scrubbing out the corners of our new barrack. My father tried to hang up a thin sheet to give Emiko a little privacy. Kenji found a lizard under the floorboards and named it Captain Tanaka. I remember lying on the thin mattress that night, staring at the ceiling slats, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks. We hadn't committed any crime. We were American citizens. I had pledged allegiance at school just a few months before, and yet they had locked us up, not for what we'd done, but for who we were. That was the day we stopped being American. At least, that's what they wanted us to believe. But even then, even in that dusty prison, my father whispered to me, "Kimi wa Nihonjin janai, anata wa Amerikajin da." You are not Japanese, you are American. And I clung to that, because when everything else is taken, your home, your rights, your name, the only thing left is what you believe about yourself. At Tule Lake, everyone got a number. Ours was 20,346B. They wrote it on our tags, our records, even our laundry slips. I was no longer just Ichiro Tanaka. I was 20,346B. The B meant I was the second child. My sister was 20,346-A. My little brother, Kenji, had a C. My parents didn't even get letters, just digits. It's strange how fast a name can disappear. We were assigned to Block 27, Barrack 8, Unit 4. The camp was a grid of such numbers. The blocks formed rows that stretched across the plain like the bones of some forgotten animal. Each barrack was built for soldiers, not families. Our unit was a single room, maybe 20 feet by 20, split between the 5 of us. No insulation, no plumbing, a potbelly stove in the corner, and a single dangling light bulb. The walls didn't reach the ceiling, so you heard everything: arguments, sobbing, snoring, whispers in the dark. At night, the wind whistled through the gaps and turned the room into an instrument of loneliness. Every morning, a loudspeaker crackled the same announcement: "Breakfast 7 a.m., mess hall 3, attendance required." The food was strange. At first it was canned sausages and white bread, then boiled cabbage and stewed prunes. Eventually they gave us rice, miso soup, sometimes even tofu, as if they thought they were doing us a favor by serving us our own food in a prison. Mama brought shoyu packets she had hidden in her suitcase. She rationed them like medicine. The lines were always long. Meals were a rush, not to savor food, but to avoid the fights. People jostled for tables. Old farmers from Fresno sat next to Kaibei boys from Los Angeles who barely spoke Japanese. The Nisei called us too American. The WRA called us too Japanese. It felt like we didn't belong to anyone anymore. But even so, small routines started to form. My father got a job in the mess hall as a cook. He used to run his own nursery back in Sacramento. Now he chopped onions with men who had owned restaurants and dry cleaners and farms. They joked together in broken English and country dialects, clinging to what was left of their dignity. Emiko began helping teach English to some of the Nisei women who wanted to understand the newspapers. She hung a little chalkboard in our unit and practiced her cursive on scraps of paper. "You have to stay useful," she'd say, even as she cried herself to sleep some nights. Kenji made friends with a boy from Seattle named Hiro. They built kites out of newspaper and scavenged sticks. On good days, they'd race around the recreation field, trying to make the kites dance past the barbed wire. Sometimes they flew high enough to cross the fence line, and sometimes the MPs would shoot them down, not always. But sometimes, no one explained why we were here. Not really. We heard the words, military necessity, national security, evacuation. But they never quite explained how my mother posed a threat to the Republic, or why my third-grade teacher, Miss Ellis, stopped writing me letters. One day they took photographs. A white man in a fedora came and asked us to stand outside our barrack. He had a clipboard and a tired smile. "Just a picture for the record," he said. We stood stiffly. I tried to smile, but my sister whispered, "Don't give them what they want." The photo came out gray and dull. You could barely make out our faces. We weren't citizens in that moment. We were exhibits. There was talk of a test, a questionnaire. People said it would decide if we were loyal. I didn't understand what it meant at first. Why would anyone question our loyalty? We'd never done anything wrong. In February of 1943, the forms came. The application for leave clearance, that was the official title. But everyone called it the loyalty questionnaire. 2 questions tore our world apart. Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Question 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor? My father stared at the form for hours. He was 52 years old. Not a soldier, not a citizen either, because the law wouldn't let him become one, no matter how long he'd lived here. If he answered yes, he was betraying Japan, the country of his birth. If he answered no, he was labeled disloyal, no win. Some people refused to answer. Others answered no, and were branded no-nos. Many of them were segregated at Tule Lake. Riots followed, fights, night raids. Loyalty became the most dangerous word in the camp. We answered yes. My father said, "This is our home, even if it doesn't want us." But I could see it wounded him, like cutting off a piece of himself. That was when the fences stopped being just wire. They became mirrors. They showed us who we were and who we weren't allowed to be. I was 20,346B, and that number meant I wasn't trusted. Not with a vote, not with a home. The days at Tule Lake began to bleed into each other like watercolors left out in the rain. It wasn't the noise that I remember most, it was the silence between things. The wind brushing against the loose planks of the barracks. The quiet stare of a man who no longer had a business, or a town, or a sense of himself. My sister Emiko said it was like living in a dream where you scream, but no sound comes out. But dreams have structure. Camp life had only routines. We woke to a bell at 6 a.m., trudged across the dust to the mess hall. Sometimes the eggs were powdered, sometimes the milk had a skin. Then school, held in repurposed barracks, run by volunteers and WRA staff. I didn't hate school. Our teacher, Mrs. Heller, was a Quaker woman from Oregon. She treated us like we were real students, not prisoners. She read us Robert Frost and Steinbeck and let us draw maps of where we used to live. I drew our little house in Sacramento, even added Duke, our dog we had to leave behind. She put it on the wall and called it hopeful. But I wasn't hopeful. I just wanted to remember. Outside school, the air was different, heavy. You felt it when walking past Block 16, where a man was taken away at night by the MPs. Rumors flew like moths. They said he had a newspaper clippings collection and spoke too openly about Japan. Maybe he refused the questionnaire. Maybe he just spoke too much. Either way, he was gone. At night, grown-ups whispered in Japanese. My parents tried to keep their voices down, but sometimes I heard words like renunciation, transfer, segregation, violence. I didn't know what they meant exactly, but I knew they made my mother stop folding clothes and my father stop eating. There were protests, hunger strikes, meetings. Some people wanted to go back to Japan. Others still clung to America like a promise half kept. Some shouted, "Cowards!" Others hissed, "Traitors!" And always the camp guards looked down from their towers, their rifles pointed at all of us, like none of it mattered. One day, a group of teenagers snuck out past curfew to protest outside the administration building. They waved signs demanding better food, fair wages for their parents' labor, and the removal of certain staff accused of abuse. They shouted in both English and Japanese. They weren't armed, just loud. The next morning, 2 of them were gone. No one said where. They just vanished. We stopped asking questions after that. But even in all of this, life persisted. I remember the absurd human things that poked through the despair like weeds in cracked pavement. There was a wedding between a girl from Los Angeles and a boy from San Jose. The bride wore a white dress sewn from bed sheets. Her father cried as she walked down the aisle of Mess Hall 8 between folding chairs and paper lanterns made from rice sacks. They danced to a scratchy recording of "I'll Be Seeing You." It was the only time I saw Mama smile for real in weeks. Then there was Mr. Fujimoto, who ran a tiny barbershop out of the laundry barrack. He charged 10 cents a haircut and gave out peppermint candies to kids who sat still. He made jokes in 3 languages. I might be imprisoned, but my scissors are still free. That made the grown-ups laugh, though it always seemed more like they were remembering something funny from before. And there were baseball games. Oh, the games! Somehow they found bats and gloves and makeshift uniforms. Someone painted Tule Lake tigers onto an old bed sheet and strung it between 2 poles. Every Sunday, families gathered near the recreation field. Kids cheered, old men heckled, and for a few hours we forgot the fences. I remember standing at bat, knees shaking, the desert sun burning through my shirt. I swung late and missed, but I heard people cheering anyway. Not for my hit, I didn't make one, but because I stood there at all. Because even striking out was something normal, something human. But normal didn't last long. The fights got worse. Blocks formed their own factions. Some supported the protesters, some sided with the WRA, others just wanted to be left alone. The mess halls echoed with accusations. Inu, that was the word they used. Dog. It meant someone who cooperated too much with the authorities, or someone who didn't resist enough. Nobody wanted to be called it, but nobody wanted to be watched either. Emiko stopped going to her English classes. She started helping Mama more, even though Mama told her not to. I think she needed something to do, something that didn't involve explaining which part of herself she was supposed to betray today. Then came the renunciation forms. After the questionnaire debacle, the government created another program, the renunciation of citizenship. They told us it was optional, but it didn't feel optional, not when camp administrators pressured people to sign and guards watched the lines. The wind at Tule Lake never stopped. It would rise early in the morning, just as the mess bells started clanging, and whistle through the spaces between the barracks. It stirred up dust until it got in your throat, your rice, your pillow. At night, It beat against the tar paper walls like a ghost trying to get in or out. I came to know that wind like a sibling, angry, persistent, always there. Life inside our block settled into strange rhythms. Mama used to say time in the camp was neither moving nor still, just waiting. We waited for better food, for news, for release. But days passed, and the same sun rose over the same fences. So we filled the space between what we lost and what might never return. We built things. Men gathered scrap wood from the supply yard and made furniture, simple but solid. Papa built a low table where we could all sit on folded blankets for meals. He carved our initials into the edge, one for each of us, with his pocket knife. It was the first time I'd seen him smile since Sacramento. We lined the cracks in the floor with rags to keep out the sand. Mama made curtains out of old flour sacks to give Emiko some privacy. Even Kenji started tending a little garden behind the latrine, coaxing green from soil no one thought could grow anything. Somehow, tiny shoots of daikon pushed through. Inside our barrack, we tried to pretend we were still a family, not a file. Mama insisted we sit together for dinner. She made onigiri with canned salmon and told stories from before the war, about Papa's stubbornness, her first time tasting Coca-Cola, the time I drew a mustache on Kenji while he was sleeping. Emiko would laugh, just a little, then retreat behind a book or a stare. Papa worked in the boiler house by then, walking a mile each way in the cold to fix leaky pipes and keep the mess halls warm. His hands, once soft from pruning azaleas, grew rough and cracked, but he never complained. "I work," he said, "because I am still alive." Kenji and I played catch when we could, using a ball made from rags and rubber bands. The guards watched, rifles slung low, their silhouettes framed in the towers like cutouts from some foreign world. Sometimes we waved, sometimes they waved back. Most didn't. One day, Kenji asked me why the guards didn't smile. "Because they don't know us," I said, "but they watch us all the time." Watching isn't the same as knowing. He chewed on that for a while, then went back to chasing his rag ball. In school, we learned about democracy and freedom, all the usual things. But I noticed Mrs. Heller started teaching us more Japanese poetry, more about how words survive places that people don't. She had a way of looking at us that didn't feel like pity. It felt like belief, like she wanted us to remember that we were more than where we'd been placed. By the time winter came, snow covered the camp in thin layers. It didn't last long, just enough to frost the roofs and quiet the wind for a while. The desert turned bone cold, the kind that settled in your knees and stayed there. One night, the stove gave out in our unit. We huddled together under blankets, our breath visible. Papa wrapped his arms around all three of us kids, his face tight with worry. He wasn't a man who showed weakness. That night, though, I saw it, the fear that we'd freeze, that he couldn't protect us. I think that's when I stopped being a boy. The next morning, men from the block came and fixed the stove. No request, just showed up. That's how things worked in the camp. We had each other, or we had nothing. There were whispers then, of unrest, of anger growing louder. Tule Lake had become the segregation center for the so-called disloyal. Tensions flared between those who had answered no and those who hadn't. Neighbors avoided each other. Old friends stopped speaking. You could feel the weight of every conversation, every glance. Then came the strike. It started with the kitchen workers in Block 42. They walked out over wages, over conditions, over the lack of response to violence from guards. Other blocks joined in. The administration called it a disturbance. We called it survival. The MPs raided barracks at night looking for agitators. They arrested men in front of their children. I saw one pulled from the bunk beneath ours, a soft-spoken man who carved toys for the children. They said he was inciting rebellion. All he'd done was write a petition. Mama told me to stay inside. "Keep your head down," she said. "Let this pass." But I couldn't unsee it. The door torn open. The boy in the next unit crying for his father. The boot prints in the snow. The wind didn't howl that night. It screamed. And yet we stayed. We endured. Somehow we still wrote letters. Papa still read the paper, circling articles in red ink. Emiko folded paper cranes from old packaging and pinned them on our wall. The dust at Tule Lake got into everything. It sank into your skin, your sheets, the seams of your lungs. It curled under your fingernails, snuck into your food, and made its home inside your throat until coughing became as common as breathing. When I think of those years, I remember the wind, yes, but more than that, I remember the dust. It was like the camp's memory, scattered across the basin, never quite settling. You couldn't wash it out, not completely. Even years later when we left, it came with us in our clothes, our shoes, our stories. By the spring of 1944, Tule Lake had become more than just a camp. It was a crucible. Over 18,000 of us packed into those barbed wire boundaries, nearly half of them no-nos who had been shipped in after answering the loyalty questionnaire with defiance, protest, or pain. The administration called us the disloyal. I never liked that word. It made it sound like we were the ones who turned away, when in truth it was America that had turned its back on us. The new arrivals changed the air. They came from other camps, other states, angry and confused, their stories different but familiar. They had seen riots, strikes, military police with clubs. Many came resentful, toward the government, toward us, toward themselves. They didn't trust the WRA, or the teachers, or each other. Tule Lake, once a place of silent endurance, began to hum with unrest. My sister Emiko noticed it first. "There's a tension here now," she whispered one night, brushing her long hair beside the stove, "like a rope pulled too tight." She wasn't wrong. In the mess hall, conversations grew sharper. At school, groups clumped by city or loyalty status. Even in our block, families avoided eye contact. You never knew if someone's brother had signed the renunciation form or joined the protest group, or if they had told the administration who did. My father became quiet, not out of fear, but from exhaustion. He kept to himself after work, folding the newspaper into neat sections, rereading editorials. He never missed a day of boiling water for tea. He poured 2 cups, one for himself, one for the photo of his parents who'd passed before the war. He would sit in silence, sipping as if they were still speaking. Meanwhile, Kenji had his 10th birthday. We couldn't get cake, so Mama baked sweet potatoes into a little pie. I drew a picture of a dragon on a paper scrap and folded it into a card. Emiko stitched him a belt from old cotton. That night we lit a candle stub and sang softly so the MPs wouldn't hear. He smiled through it, even laughed. And that laugh, it broke something in me. Because he didn't remember life outside this fence. Not really. Tule Lake was the only world he knew. His earliest memory was the ride on the relocation train. His dreams were of towers and barracks and wind. That same week, the Army recruiters returned, this time with pressure. They visited the schoolhouse. "The 442nd Regimental Combat Team needs brave young men," the officer said. "Loyal Americans." He didn't say Japanese American, just Americans, like we needed permission to belong. Some boys volunteered, some saw it as a way out, others saw it as betrayal. I saw it as too complicated for a 15-year-old to fully understand. But I watched them go. I watched mothers pretend not to cry and fathers pretend to be proud. In the evenings, I kept writing. I wrote about the shadows the guard towers cast at dusk, about how Kenji named each one after an animal. Tower 1 was the bear, Tower 2 was the hawk. He said the guards looked like they were watching a zoo. Emiko found one of my poems and didn't say anything, just kissed my head and tucked it back under my mattress. That summer, something happened that still sticks with me. A group of boys from our block, mostly older teenagers, got caught near the boundary fence. They weren't trying to escape. They were testing the patrol schedule. They wanted to prove they could do something bold, something that made them feel alive. One had painted a wooden sword to look like a katana. They called themselves the Kibei Resistance, though it was more play acting than war. But the guards didn't see it that way. 2 were arrested. 1 was beaten badly. The rest were sent to isolation. For weeks, the adults whispered, "What will they do to them? Will they send them to Tule Lake jail? Will their families be punished?" None of us knew. No one ever told us anything. But for days afterward, I saw their mothers sweeping the barrack steps at night, crying when they thought no one could hear. And that's when I began to understand something Papa never said aloud, that dignity was something you protected quietly. Not for others, but for yourself. In the brushing of dust from a brother's sleeve, in the heating of water, in the refusal to bow your head even as the sky bore down. The loyalty questionnaire arrived like a match dropped in dry grass. It came in brown government envelopes, printed in English, with boxes to check. Dozens of questions, some about your education, some about your associations, some about your beliefs, but only 2 really mattered. Questions 27 and 28. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor? It was a trap. That's what people whispered. A double-edged sword disguised as a formality. Say yes, and they questioned your sincerity. Say no, and you were labeled disloyal, segregated, and sometimes worse. We weren't soldiers, we were prisoners, and now they were asking us to choose our cage. Papa studied the form for a long time at our table. The sun had gone down, and our barrack smelled of steamed rice and rust. He didn't speak at first, just tapped a pencil lightly against the paper. Then he said, "What kind of country locks you away, then asked you to die for it?" None of us answered. Mama was wringing a cloth in her hands, her face pale and tired. Emiko leaned against the wall, her eyes narrow with the kind of sadness that lives deep in the bones. Kenji was too young to understand. He just stared at us all, confused, like he was watching a play without knowing the language. Some men tore up the forms. Some filled in no out of anger. Others out of principle. Still others simply refused to answer. Then there were those who said, Yes, yes, just to keep their families together, or to avoid segregation, or to escape the camp, even if it meant war. It didn't matter which way you chose, someone would hate you for it. We didn't talk about it in school, but everyone was buzzing. Rumors flew, whole families being moved to a different section of camp, a new detention center being built, boys being sent to draft boards straight from behind the wire. One of my classmates, a boy named George from Fresno, broke down crying in the middle of class. His brother had said, no, but George wanted to enlist. They weren't speaking. When Mrs. Heller tried to comfort him, he just kept saying, I want to be American. I want to prove it. I didn't know how to help him. That night, Emiko and I sat outside, our backs to the barrack. The stars above Tule Lake looked different, sharper, colder than back in Sacramento. She said they reminded her of broken glass. You ever think, she asked, that they don't want us to belong? They? I asked. All of them. The people outside the fence. Maybe even the ones who built it. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. I just stared up at the sky, thinking about the words on that questionnaire. Forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. I had never pledged allegiance to any emperor. I'd never even been to Japan. The only emperor I knew was the one I read about in old samurai books. To forswear him felt like denying something I was never guilty of. But America wasn't innocent either. Papa finally checked no on both, quietly, without discussion. They'll call me disloyal, he said, but I've already been judged. He wasn't alone. Thousands of others did the same. Tule Lake became the segregation center, the place they sent the no-nos, the troublemakers, the disloyals. The barbed wire doubled, new MPs arrived, and slowly the camp's identity changed. It became a place of punishment, of hard stares and deep suspicion. Our family stayed in the same block, but it felt like a different world. People whispered more. Gatherings were watched. Tension lingered like heat. Emiko started skipping school. She joined a group of women who made clothing for children whose families had lost everything. Sometimes I'd find her sitting by the stove, unraveling old sweaters and humming Japanese songs under her breath. I began writing again. But this time it wasn't poetry. It was a letter. To the President, I wrote, I am an American citizen. I was born in California. I don't know what I did wrong, but I think about it every night. I think about it when the guards watch me eat, when they search our barrack, when my father doesn't sleep. I never sent it, but I read it to myself often. The camp grew colder in spirit. Neighbors stopped greeting one another. Fights broke out during meal lines. Someone vandalized the laundry building, painting Inu across the wall, dog meaning traitor. One night a fire broke out near the administration offices. No one knew how it started. Some said it was an accident, others whispered sabotage. But the MPs responded fast, faster than I'd ever seen. Sirens wailed, spotlights cut through the camp, and then came the arrests. 10 men, all from our section. They were taken without explanation. We never saw them again. I was 16 the year my mother sat me down and told me we might no longer be Americans. It was early 1945, and the war was beginning to tip. Rumors filtered through the fences like dust. Tokyo bombed, Allied forces advancing, camps closing. But not Tule Lake. Not us. We were the ones who had said no. We were the segregated, the suspect, the expendable. That's when the government gave us a new form, another paper, another question. Do you wish to renounce your United States citizenship? Renounce. It was a word with weight, more than forswear or disloyal. This wasn't just about allegiance. This was about belonging, about identity. It was about giving up the only home we had ever known. Mama clutched the form with both hands like it might tear itself away. "They want us to sign it," she said, "so they can send us away, back to Japan. But what's there for us? I haven't seen Japan in 30 years. You children never have." Some families signed it out of anger, others out of fear. A few thought they were going to be deported anyway, so they figured it was better to control the terms. And some, like my friend George's parents, were told that if they didn't sign, their whole family might be separated. It wasn't a real choice. It was coercion in cursive. At the mess hall, people argued in hushed tones over steamed rice. Some whispered that they'd rather live in Hiroshima than Tule Lake. Others warned that renunciation was a one-way door, that you'd lose your passport, your protection, your right to return. I remember Emiko refusing outright. "No piece of paper can make me less American," she said, "or more Japanese." But Papa was different. He didn't fill it out. He didn't tear it up either. He just folded it, tucked it into his coat, and walked outside into the wind. He didn't return until dark. I never asked what he decided. We didn't talk about such things. I do know that many who signed the form later regretted it. I watched neighbors weep as they packed their belongings, boarding trucks for Bismarck or Sharp Park or ships to Japan. Some had no relatives there, others didn't speak the language. A few were children. And then, as the days passed, the lawyers arrived. One of them was a man named Wayne Collins, a white man from San Francisco with a stubborn jaw and a voice like iron. He came to Tule Lake and told us we'd been tricked, that our renunciations weren't lawful, that they could be fought. He called it a shameful act in a moment of fear. Papa listened. For the first time in months, he leaned forward at a meeting. Collins talked about the Constitution, about due process, about fighting not with fists, but with paper, with law. I'd never seen a lawyer speak with such fire. Years later, I'd read that Collins spent more than 2 decades fighting to restore citizenship to those who renounced it. He succeeded, not all at once, but one by one. Over 5,000 people, their rights returned. Back then, I didn't understand the scale. I only knew that when Papa finally spoke, he said, "Maybe we don't need to go anywhere after all." But the damage was done. The community was cracked. There were those who had signed, and those who hadn't. Families were split, friends divided. Some resented those who resisted, others shunned those who didn't. The camp, already broken by wind and time, began to collapse inward. School grew quieter, lessons shorter. My teacher told us she would be transferred to another camp, and she cried when she said goodbye. She hugged Emiko, told her to keep writing. I saw Emiko tuck a poem into the teacher's suitcase when she wasn't looking. I never saw what it said. Meanwhile, Kenji stopped playing outside. The other boys teased him, said his family was traitors. He didn't understand. He asked me what it meant. I didn't have the heart to tell him. I just told him to come inside. That winter, the pipes froze. Our barrack grew so cold the walls cracked. Mama's cough returned, sharp and low, like it came from the ribs. I gave her my blanket. She still shivered. And through it all, we waited. For the war to end, for word from relatives, for someone to remember that we existed. I remember walking to the latrine one night. The wind had died, the moon full above the fence. A guard in Tower 4 watched me silently. I paused. "You cold?" I asked him. He said nothing. Then he nodded. Once. In that moment I realized something. We were all trapped, him behind a rifle, me behind my name. And even when they opened the gates, neither of us would be the same. They didn't open the gates all at once. There was no trumpet call, no official apology, no grand announcement, just whispers. Then paper notices tacked to mess hall doors. And then trucks, schedules, the soft creak of belongings packed too many times into the same weathered suitcases. It was late 1945 when the War Relocation Authority told us we could leave. Just like that. After 4 years, they were closing Tule Lake. After 4 years, we were free. But we didn't celebrate. We didn't know what we were returning to. Some families had lost their homes, others their land. Most had no money, no jobs, no apology, just their names and a few boxes. A bus ticket if they were lucky. They handed you $25, resettlement allowance they called it, and pointed east, west, anywhere but here. We didn't know where to go. Papa stared at the map for hours. Sacramento was home once, but the neighbors there had petitioned to keep us out. Our old store had been vandalized, the windows broken, the sign scraped clean. "Maybe Chicago," Emiko said. "They say people are starting over there." But Mama wanted to stay closer to California, in case someone we know still remembers. As we debated, families disappeared one by one. Some left overnight, others gathered their neighbors, said their goodbyes with tears and promises, and the exchange of rice crackers wrapped in paper napkins. Kenji didn't understand. "I thought we were already in America," he whispered. We were, and we weren't. The truth was the camp had become its own kind of country, a warped one, a wounded one. But still, a place with routine, neighbors, shared language, a place where we all carried the same weight, where we knew the pain in each other's eyes. Outside the fence, that would vanish. Outside, the world hadn't waited for us. It had gone on building and forgetting, and now we had to return to it, changed but unacknowledged. The day we left Tule Lake, I stood at the edge of the barbed wire and watched the guard tower, Tower 4, the one closest to our barrack. The same guard stood inside, helmet slanted back. I couldn't see his face. I raised a hand. He didn't wave, but he didn't look away either. And then we stepped onto the truck. We traveled in silence. Across dry roads, past towns that still had signs, "No Japs," through counties where sheriffs tracked every movement, over hills where I imagined home might still be waiting. We ended up in Stockton. A church offered us their basement. It was cramped, musty, but dry. We laid our futons on the concrete and tried not to think about the desert. Emiko found work as a secretary. She typed with fierce precision, said little, laughed less. Papa worked as a janitor at a grocery store, the same store he once owned. No one said anything, not to his face. But someone keyed his bike. Another left a dead fish on the church steps. A child threw a rock at Kenji on the walk home. When we told the teacher, she said, "Kids are still adjusting." So were we. I went back to school. The teachers called me Tom, though my name was Taro. I didn't correct them. Some classmates were kind. One girl brought me a peach from her backyard. Another asked if I'd ever been to Japan. I told her no. She blinked, confused. The hardest part was how invisible it all became. No one talked about the camps. No one asked what it was like to live behind wire, to be labeled enemy because of your face, to lose your home, your rights, your language, and still be expected to say thank you. One day, Emiko wrote an article for a local paper. She titled it, "After the Fence." She didn't ask permission. She wrote about the loyalty questionnaire, the renunciations, the guards. She wrote about our mother coughing through winter nights, about our father silently sweeping dust from the corners of his pride. She wrote about hope. The editor didn't publish it, but she framed the manuscript. It hung in our living room for years. Mama passed quietly the following spring. Her lungs never recovered. Papa didn't speak at the funeral, but afterward he folded his coat carefully, took out a wrinkled envelope, and burned it in a tin can behind the church, the renunciation form. It turned to ash with a whisper. We rebuilt, slowly, bit by bit. But we never returned to what we were. That version of us remained at Tule Lake, scattered with the dust. Still, some things survived. Kenji kept a wooden carving of the camp's watchtower on his desk well into adulthood. Said it reminded him not to forget. Emiko moved to Los Angeles. She wrote books. She changed her name back. And me? I stayed. I taught. I raised a family. I told stories, mostly to those who didn't want to hear them. Until one day, a boy in my class, his name was Marcus, asked, "Did camps like that really happen?" And I said, "Yes, they did." He didn't believe me. Memory isn't a photograph. It isn't tidy. It doesn't sit in albums or stay tucked in dusty boxes. No. Memory is a fence, rusted in places, sharp in others. It doesn't keep things out. It keeps them in, buried just beneath the surface. I never meant to remember Tule Lake as much as I do. After we resettled in Stockton, life became a process of pruning, cutting off what didn't belong. We cut off the language. Mama stopped speaking Nihongo except in her dreams. We cut off the food. Papa refused to grow daikon in the yard anymore, said the neighbors would get ideas. We cut off our names. Emiko became Emily, Kenji was Kenny, and I became Tom, full-time. Not Taro, not even T, just Tom, round and American like a diner pie. It worked for a while. I wore a varsity jacket in high school. I went to prom. I got a job at the shoe store, then at the post office. People called me Sir. Some of them probably forgot I'd ever lived behind a fence, but I hadn't. One spring, I visited a college friend in San Francisco. On the way back, I stopped at the site of an old camp, not Tule Lake, but a smaller one, an assembly center. It was just a fairground now. Kids were eating ice cream where we had once stood in line to be processed. The stables were gone, but when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the shuffle of feet on straw. That's when I understood something. Forgetting is a skill, and I was losing my grip on it. Later, in my 20s, I started to dream again. Always the same, a guard tower, then silence, a knock at the door, my mother's coughing in the cold, my sister standing at the fence, her hand open like she's waiting to be handed back her life. Sometimes the dreams didn't wake me, but I'd still feel them all day, like dust in the corners of my breath. I met someone. Her name was Grace. She wasn't Japanese. She asked me questions no one else did. One night, over tea, she asked what I remembered most about camp. I didn't know what to say. The food, the silence, the shame. Finally, I said, "The wind." She didn't laugh. She just nodded. We married in 1959. She was strong and sharp, the kind of woman who carried books in her purse and remembered what strangers said in elevators. When we had our daughter, Naomi, I thought about giving her a Japanese name, but I didn't. I told myself I was protecting her. She grew up without the fence. She had a bright mind, a loud laugh, and a stubborn streak, just like Emiko. She asked questions, too. What was it like? Did they really make you go? Were you angry? At first I said, it was just the times. But that was a lie. The truth was, I didn't know how to talk about it, not then. That changed in 1988. I was older, grayer, slower. Grace had passed. Naomi had children of her own. And then the government finally admitted what we all knew. The camps were wrong. A formal apology, a check in the mail, $20,000. Not enough to buy back a childhood, but it wasn't about the money. It was the words. A grave injustice was done. For the first time, it felt like someone had looked at our fence and seen it for what it was. That same year, I was invited to speak at a local school. The students were learning about World War II. They had never heard of Tule Lake. So I stood in front of a chalkboard, knees stiff, and told them about the loyalty questionnaire, about my mother's trembling hands, about my father's quiet fury. I told them about the dust, the lines, the poems Emiko used to write and hide under her cot. They asked good questions, some hard. Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't Americans help? Would you do it again? I answered each one as best I could. Then a boy in the back, maybe 12, raised his hand. Did you forgive them? I blinked. Forgiveness is a strange word. It sounds clean, like water, but it's heavy. I don't think they ever asked for it, I said. And maybe that's the part that still hurts. I paused. But yes, I think I forgave them, because not forgiving would mean I carried it forever, and I didn't want to give them that too. The boy nodded. Afterward, the teacher handed me a bouquet. I stood at the edge of the classroom, looking at the children's faces. None of them looked like mine, but their eyes were wide, listening. I thought of Mama, of Emiko, of Kenji and Papa and the others who never told their stories. And I realized that memory, even when it's a fence, is also a path. It keeps what matters close. And if we walk it with care, maybe, just maybe, someone on the other side hears us coming. I went back one last time. Tule Lake. The name still made my ribs tighten, like I was waiting to be called for roll. But I needed to go. Not for closure, I think, but for continuity. To stand on that soil again. To listen in case anything was still whispering from beneath the sand. It was summer. The sun was low when I arrived. The old camp was long gone, bulldozed, erased, paved over in parts. But the landscape remained, that endless desert horizon, the ragged bluffs, the same wind that once pushed grit through every crack in the barracks now moved freely over the open land. The only thing left standing was one of the towers, Tower 4. They'd turned part of the site into a historical landmark, modest, half-forgotten, a rusted plaque, some photographs behind glass, a map where kids had scrawled hearts and initials. I stood at the edge of the barbed wire replica and looked out. All that remained of our confinement were shadows. And yet, I could still hear Papa's quiet shoes pacing the floor, still see Emiko writing poems in a composition book with cracked corners, still feel Mama's hands on my cheeks the night her fever broke, her whisper, "You are not where you belong." They were all gone now. Mama passed in 46, Papa not long after. Emiko died in the 70s, a teacher with dozens of students who never knew what she'd survived. Kenny, he moved to the coast, became a mechanic, never talked about camp again. Even I barely did. until I had no choice, until history threatened to forget us altogether. A few years before this trip, Naomi had invited me to speak at a museum exhibit on Japanese-American internment. I told her I was too old, too tired. She said, "Then let me tell your story for you." That was what changed me. I started to write again. Notes, memories, letters never sent. I collected newspaper clippings, photos, even my old school ID from the assembly center. I gave them to her, and she turned it all into a record, a living one. She titled it, "Our Words in the Dust." I asked why. She said, "Because that's where they tried to bury you." Now, standing here again, my knees aching and the wind slicing across my shoulders, I understood what she meant. This land had once held the weight of thousands. Now it held silence. But silence doesn't mean absence. It means listening harder. I stepped forward. There used to be a mess hall right there. I could still see the outline of the floor, bare patches where concrete once lay. I knelt and placed my hand on the earth. It was warm. In my pocket I had a slip of paper, a copy of one of Emiko's poems. I had read it aloud at her funeral. I read it again now, the paper trembling in my hands. We were not lost, only planted in ash. Like seeds that waited out the storm, they built fences. But we remembered sky, and still we grow toward it. I folded the poem and pressed it into the dirt beneath a small rock, not as a burial, as a root. As I stood, I noticed a young man nearby. He looked maybe 20, Asian, holding a camera. He gave me a polite nod. "Are you here for the tour?" he asked. I smiled. "No, son. I was the tour." He blinked. "You were?" "I lived here, 1942 to 46. His eyebrows rose. He lowered his camera. I read about it in class." "Reading it," I said, "isn't the same as remembering it." He nodded slowly. "My grandfather was in Minidoka. He never talked about it." I gave him a long look. "Then maybe it's time someone did." He lifted his camera again, but not to take a picture, just to hold it like a witness. "Can I take your story?" I laughed gently. "I've been giving it away my whole life." He smiled. "I'll help carry it." And that was enough. I turned back toward the horizon. The wind picked up, not violent, just present, like a breath from something older than both of us. You cannot unwrite what was done. You cannot unlive the fences, but you can speak. And in speaking, scatter seeds. I came home that night to Naomi's house. My great-grandson was building a paper tower with popsicle sticks. "What's that?" I asked. "A guard tower," he said, "like in the story." I nodded. "Does it watch over the bad guys?" He shook his head. "Number it watches so nobody forgets." I knelt beside him. "That's the best kind of tower there is." He handed me a stick. "Want to help?" And so we built it together, not out of wood or wire or fear, but out of memory.